The dust was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated her tongue and turned the sweat on her skin to grime. From inside the cage, the world was a grid of jeering faces, distorted by the heat rising from the parched earth. Maeve had long since stopped seeing them as individuals. They were a single entity, a beast of casual cruelty whose laughter was the crackle of a brush fire. They called her cattle. They called her a burden, a joke sold to the highest bidder, a too-fat bride for a man with no other options. The words had weight once, but now they were just sounds, like the buzzing of flies on the bars of her prison. She focused instead on the sliver of horizon visible between the sheriff's office and the general store, a slash of indifferent blue. That was real. The sun beating on the tin roof of her cage was real. The rest was a bad dream she had forgotten how to wake from. The auctioneer's voice droned on, a foul melody of derision. Then, a silence fell. Not a complete silence, but a hushing of the crowd's worst edges. A man had stepped forward. He was tall and broad, but it was the quiet that surrounded him that she noticed first. He moved with a deliberateness that seemed to absorb the noise around him. He didn't gawk or sneer. He simply looked at her, his gaze not lingering on her form, but on her eyes. There was a stillness in him, the kind she'd seen in old mountains or deep water. The townspeople snickered, nudging each other. A lone rancher, they muttered, a man as silent as the dirt he worked. The bidding was a formality, a performance of mockery. He laid down his money without a word, the clink of coins a final, definitive sound. And then he was unlocking her cage. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird seeking its own escape. She didn't know if this was a new, more private hell, but as his large, calloused hand offered not to grab, but simply to steady her exit, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in an age, a fragile, terrifying hope, took root in the barren soil of her soul. The journey was a long stretch of silence punctuated by the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of wagon wheels. The sun beat down, vast and unforgiving. The prairie rolled out on all sides, an ocean of dry grass that seemed to swallow the narrow track they followed. Maeve sat on the hard bench, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She was acutely aware of the man beside her, Arthur. He had not spoken a single word since leaving the town. He held the reins with a steady, practiced grip, his knuckles scarred, his hands looking as though they were carved from the same tough, weathered wood as the wagon itself. He felt less like a man and more like a feature of the landscape, solid and unreadable. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. The town's cruelty was a known thing, a loud, public spectacle. This quiet was different. It was a canvas onto which she could paint 1,000 terrible possibilities. Yet, his actions contradicted her fears. When he stopped the horse by a small, trickling creek, he didn't order her to fetch water. He climbed down, filled a ladle from his own canteen, and offered it to her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers for a moment. There was no demand in them, no expectation. It was a simple offering. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his. The water was cool and clean, and it felt like a sacrament. She watched him as he let the horse drink, his movements unhurried and gentle. This man, who had bought her like a sack of flour, treated his animal with a quiet respect that the people in town had not shown another living soul. The contradiction was a seed of confusion in her mind. She was no longer in a cage of iron bars, but the invisible walls of uncertainty were just as tall. As the wagon started moving again, she looked at his profile against the endless sky and wondered if she had merely traded one form of prison for another, or if this silent, somber man was, in his own way, just as captive as she was. They arrived at a place that was less a ranch and more a lonely argument against the vastness of the prairie. A small, sturdy cabin stood against the wind, its wood bleached gray by the sun. A barn, equally weathered, leaned slightly as if tired of the constant fight. There was no fence, no other sign of human life for miles in any direction. The emptiness of it all was breathtaking and terrifying. Arthur pulled the wagon to a halt and, in his usual silence, climbed down. He didn't pull her down or command her to follow. He walked to the cabin's front door, pushed it open, and then simply stood aside, gesturing for her to enter. The invitation hung in the air, a quiet question. Maeve hesitated, her feet feeling rooted to the floor of the wagon. This was the moment of truth. She slid down, her legs stiff, and walked cautiously toward the threshold. The inside of the cabin was sparse, but impeccably clean. A simple cot was made up in one corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a stone hearth was swept clean of any ash. A single, mended cup and a plate sat on a shelf. This was not the den of a monster. It was the home of someone who lived a life pared down to its essentials, a life of deliberate solitude. That night, she watched through the cabin's single window as he brought a blanket out to the barn. He was leaving her the house, the bed, the shelter. He was choosing the cold floor and the company of his horse over asserting any kind of claim on her. The gesture was so profound, so contrary to the transaction that had brought her here, that it left her reeling. Lying on the cot, wrapped in a coarse but clean blanket, Maeve listened to the sound of the wind howling outside. It sounded like the loneliest thing in the world, a voice for the great, empty spaces, both outside and within her. The cabin was not a cage, she realized. It was a shelter. But shelter from what, and for how long, she did not yet know. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun. Arthur would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and efficient, and work until the last light faded from the sky. He mended harnesses, dug out stubborn rocks from the unyielding soil, and tended to his horse with a quiet devotion. He never spoke to her, but his presence was a constant, solid thing on the edge of her awareness. Maeve, accustomed to a life of forced idleness, felt a stirring of purpose. She began tentatively, sweeping the cabin floor, fetching water from the well. He never acknowledged her work with words, but when she mended a tear in his shirt and left it folded on his chair, she found a small pile of freshly chopped firewood by the door the next morning. It was a conversation without a single sound, a barter of effort and respect. One afternoon, after she had spent hours weeding a small, neglected patch of earth near the cabin, hoping to coax some life from it, she returned to the porch to find a small object sitting on the railing. It was a bird, carved from a scrap of pale wood. It was crudely shaped, the wing lines hesitant, but it was unmistakably a bird in flight. She picked it up, its rough surface warm from the sun. It was light in her palm, a fragile, impossible thing. She looked toward the fields where Arthur was working, a distant figure against the horizon. This was his. He had made this. It felt like the first word spoken between them, a message she didn't fully understand but whose meaning resonated deep within her. It wasn't a demand or a statement. It was an offering. She took the small wooden bird inside, placing it on the windowsill where it could catch the morning light. It was a strange and delicate piece of beauty in a world that had been relentlessly ugly. And for the first time, looking at the tiny, silent creature, Maeve felt the possibility that she, too, might one day remember how to fly. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the air thick and heavy with unspoken tension. When the storm finally broke, it was with a terrifying violence. Rain came down in sheets, and the wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin like a tormented spirit. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting in two. Maeve was stoking the fire when the first great clap echoed across the plains. She saw Arthur, who had been oiling a saddle near the door, flinch as if struck. His whole body went rigid, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists. The tool he was holding fell to the floor with a clatter. His face, usually a stoic mask, was pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a terror that was not of the storm, but of a memory the storm had awakened. He stumbled back, pressing himself against the wall as another peal of thunder shook the very foundations of the small house. He didn't make a sound, but his silent panic was more eloquent than any scream. He was somewhere else, trapped in another time, another noise. Maeve, whose own past was littered with the ghosts of loss, recognized the shape of his haunting. She knew better than to speak, to offer empty platitudes. Pain like that was a private country with borders no one else could cross. Instead, she moved slowly, deliberately. She stoked the fire until it blazed brightly, a warm and steady heart in the tumultuous dark. She brewed some of the mint tea she had found growing wild by the creek. When it was ready, she poured it into the single mended cup and walked over to him. She didn't touch him. She simply held out the cup. He stared at it for a long moment, his ragged breathing slowly beginning to even out. Then, his gaze lifted to hers. In his eyes, she saw the receding shadows of his personal storm, and in their place, a flicker of raw, unguarded gratitude. He took the cup, his hand still trembling, a silent acknowledgement of her silent compassion. The larder was growing bare. A trip to town was unavoidable, a journey back into the world that had branded and discarded her. The thought filled Maeve with a cold dread, but the idea of sending Arthur alone, to face their judgment on her behalf, was even worse. When he hitched the horse to the wagon, she wordlessly climbed up onto the seat beside him. He gave her a long, questioning look, his brow furrowed, but he didn't protest. The town was just as she remembered, dusty, mean-spirited, and suffocating. As they walked toward the general store, the whispers started, a sibilant tide of gossip and scorn. "There's the hermit and his prize," a woman muttered from behind a curtain. "Wonder if he keeps her in a pen at night," a man snickered to his friends. Maeve felt their eyes on her like physical blows. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the rough fabric of her dress. She instinctively braced herself for the shame, for the familiar feeling of being less than human. But this time was different. Arthur walked beside her, his stride unbroken, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He was a bulwark of silence against their noise. He didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their existence. His complete indifference was a more powerful defense than any angry retort could ever be. Inside the store, the proprietor looked her up and down with a greasy smile, his eyes lingering. Before he could speak, Arthur stepped subtly between them, blocking his view. He pointed to the sacks of flour, the beans, the salt, conducting the entire transaction with grunts and gestures. He was a shield, a silent, unmovable wall between her and the world's ugliness. Walking back to the wagon, the whispers still followed them, but they no longer pierced her skin. They felt distant, irrelevant. She was not the lone object of their scorn anymore. She was with him. They were two solitary islands, now connected by an unseen, unspoken treaty against the cruelties of the mainland. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a comfortable, shared weight. They had settled into a routine that felt less like an arrangement and more like a partnership. He tended the land, she tended the home. It was a life of simple, repeating tasks, and in that repetition, she found a sense of peace she had long thought impossible. Tonight, however, the quiet felt different, more purposeful. Arthur sat on the floor, staring into the flames, a long, thin stick held loosely in his hand. Maeve watched him from her chair, mending a tear in a blanket. After a long while, he leaned forward and began to draw in the thin layer of dust and ash on the hearthstone. His movements were slow, deliberate. First, he drew a small, crude box with vertical lines. A cage. Her breath caught in her throat. Then, inside the cage, he drew a small, stick-like figure. Her. He paused, his gaze fixed on the simple, heartbreaking image. He looked up at her, his eyes asking a question she could not yet decipher. Then he returned to his drawing. Beside the cage, he drew a much larger figure. Him. With a final, decisive stroke, he drew a line from the large figure's hand, breaking through the bars of the cage. He looked at the drawing, then back at her, his expression unreadable but intense. He wasn't just telling her the story of how they met. He was telling her something more. That he understood. He knew what it was to be trapped. He was showing her a piece of his own shattered past, a story he had no words for. Overwhelmed, Maeve put down her mending, knelt on the floor beside him, and placed her hand gently on the stone, her fingers just shy of touching his stark, powerful drawing. It was her answer. I see you. I understand. The flock on the windowsill was growing. A new wooden bird appeared every few days, each one a marker of their shared, silent time. The craftsmanship evolved. The early, rough-hewn shapes had given way to more delicate, detailed carvings. She could see the texture of individual feathers, the gentle curve of a beak, the subtle tilt of a head. Each bird was a testament to his patience, to the quiet world that existed inside his mind. She would run her fingers over them, feeling the smooth, sanded wood, imagining his large, calloused hands working with such precision and tenderness. The birds were his vocabulary, his poetry. They spoke of resilience, of freedom, of the persistent instinct to take flight even after a long confinement. One evening, she came inside to find his newest creation. Her heart gave a sudden, powerful leap. It was different from all the others. He had carved 2 birds, perched close together on a single, shared branch. They were facing the same direction, their tiny wooden heads tilted as if listening to the same song. The symbolism was so clear, so profound, it stole the air from her lungs. This wasn't just a bird anymore. This was us. It was a declaration, a question, and an answer all in one. It spoke of companionship, of a shared perch in the vast, lonely wilderness. Without thinking, she went to her small satchel, the one containing the few meager possessions she had from her past life. She pulled out a thin piece of worn leather twine, a remnant of something long since broken. She returned to the carving and, with careful, reverent fingers, she tied the twine around the base of the branch, knotting it securely. It was her addition to his story. His craft, her bond. 2 separate lives, 2 broken things, now tied together not by a transaction, but by a choice. The seasons turned. The harsh, bleached landscape began to soften at the edges. Patches of green appeared on the prairie, and one morning, Maeve saw a flash of defiant color near the porch steps. A single prairie rose had pushed its way through the hard-packed earth, its bloom a delicate, fierce pink against the muted tones of the ranch. She would look at it every day, this small, tenacious miracle. It felt like a symbol of their life here, a testament to the fact that beautiful things could grow in the most inhospitable of places. It was a survivor, just like them. Arthur must have seen her watching it, though as always, he said nothing. He simply observed, his silent gaze taking in the world with an attention to detail she was only just beginning to appreciate. A few days later, she woke to the smell of fresh coffee and wood smoke, a comforting aroma that had become the scent of her new life. On the table, next to her mended cup, was another carving. This one was not a bird. It was a perfect, intricately detailed wooden rose, its petals so finely wrought they looked as if they might tremble in the breeze. It was the most beautiful, most complex thing he had ever made. It was a new symbol, a new word in their silent language. It wasn't about flight or freedom anymore. It was about putting down roots. It was about the beauty found not in escape, but in staying. She looked up at him as he stood by the hearth, watching her. His face was calm, the old storm in his eyes finally at peace. And then, he did something that shocked her more than any thunderclap or cruel jeer ever could. He spoke. His voice was a low, raspy thing, rough from years of disuse, as if he were pulling the sound up from a deep, forgotten well. Just one word. Home. It settled in the quiet air between them, not an observation, but a destination. A place they had finally, against all odds, arrived at together. They sat on the porch, a comfortable silence stretching between them as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon. The collection of wooden birds and the single rose sat on the windowsill behind them, a silent chronicle of their journey. A cool breeze stirred, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Maeve leaned her head back against the rough wood of the cabin, feeling a profound sense of peace settle deep in her bones. She had once believed that freedom was a wide-open space, the absence of bars and walls. But here, in this small, isolated corner of the world, she had found a different kind of freedom. It wasn't in the endless sky above them, but in the quiet space between them. It was the freedom to be seen without being judged, to be cared for without being owned, to be silent without being lonely. It was the freedom that grew from a single, simple choice, the choice to be kind in a world that was not. Arthur reached over, his large hand gently covering hers where it rested on the bench. It was a simple, solid weight. A promise. An anchor. They didn't need words. Their story was written in calloused hands, in carved wood, in the shared rhythm of 2 solitary heartbeats that had learned to beat as one. If you were moved by their story, Please show your support by liking this video and subscribing for more tales that touch the heart. It begs the question, doesn't it? What is a person truly worth?